Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today we are honored to host KAZU HAGA, a community leader, healer, and practitioner of nonviolence and restorative justice. He is the founder and former director of the East Point Peace Academy in Oakland, and he has been an active nonviolence trainer in global justice movements in the 1990s and has since led many workshops worldwide. He is the recipient of several awards, including the Martin Luther King Jr. Award and the Gil Lopez Award for Peacemaking. He is the author of Healing Resistance and his latest, which is Fierce Vulnerability, we will discuss today. He teaches nonviolence, conflict resolution, and restorative justice, and also organizes mindfulness sessions in prisons, high schools, and with youth groups and activist communities internationally. This is the book, which I highly recommend, Fierce Vulnerability, Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. You will find things in here no matter how long you've worked in a movement and how long you've been involved in conflict resolution and social justice movements that you've never read before. So I highly recommend it. Every activist should read it. So welcome, KAZU. Great to have you here.
Having me. It's good to be here.
All right, I think you're a little bit low. Should we move your volume up a
Oh,
little?
yeah. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, much better.
Oh,
Okay, so because of the topic of your book and the title, I'd like you to explain how trauma impacts not only our personal relationships, but how we behave and interact in social groups like our activist movements. How does our personal trauma show up in the way we work in organizations? You use fractals as an example of of the rippling effect of trauma, which I thought was very useful. So maybe you could start by explaining that metaphor, and I guess it's more than a metaphor, but explain that and how our trauma impacts our relation in groups.
yeah, absolutely. So obviously, we know now from science that when our trauma is triggered, the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance, the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about concepts like interdependence, the parts of our brain that is capable of healing from trauma is physiologically cut off. Right? There's a part of our brain called the amygdala that kind of takes over and it shuts down the most evolved part of our brain, which is also the part of our brain that can practice nonviolence. And it's the part of our brain that can have compassion for people we disagree with, to integrate new information or to try to understand different perspectives. That all gets lost to us. And the thing I was sharing about fractals is that, fractals is this like geometric pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again. So no matter how small of a thing you zoom into or how large of a scale you zoom out to, it looks the same because the pattern repeats itself. And one of the things that I'm sharing in the book is that I've come to understand that fractals is one of the universal laws of nature. I really do believe that this universe is built on fractals. And so what that means relative to trauma is that the same ways that trauma impacts my body as an individual, and it doesn't, like, if I have unresolved trauma, it impacts my ability to have close, intimate, healed relationships with members of my family, with my community. That same thing applies to our larger and larger scales of bodies. So trauma impacts me the same way it impacts my family as a collective unit. It impacts cultures. It impacts nation states, right? Like if I haven't healed my own childhood traumas, I act out, lash out, hurt other people. And it's the same way if you take like a nation state like the United States, if the United States has collective trauma that it hasn't healed, it will lash out and hurt other nation states. And so that's a lot of the central theory of fierce vulnerabilities, understanding how trauma impacts us at different scales on the fractal.
And we see how our unresolved trauma as a country, having slavery in our past and robbing indigenous lands from the people who lived here originally, has impacted and something we've not ever really quite dealt with. We have in patches, but you bring up an interesting point, which I want to get to later, is that accountability is not the same as punishment. And I think that's a really important distinction that you make and that we should be aware of. But right now, I want to go to some of the strategies that you've talked about in the book and about the need for us to open up and create new types of protests, new types of strategies. You use a quote there in the book from Audre Lorde, who I thought it was very interesting that they use this because it's something to think about and even meditate on. Quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I think that's brilliant because a lot of the tools we use in protest movements are the things we've kind of learned in the master's backyard. So I would like you to talk a little bit about what are some of the creative ways that protests could change that you think would make them more effective?
Yeah, so one of the things you said is that oftentimes, even in nonviolent movements, we are engaged in nonviolent action, but we use nonviolent action as a way to harness power, and then we use that power to force change down the throats of the opposing side. And it's that dynamic of whether it's violent power or nonviolent power, using power to force change that the other side doesn't want. It's that dynamic that is the master's tool, right? Of like domination, hierarchy, and overpowering the other side. And one of the things that we're exploring in Fierce Vulnerability is the idea that injustice is not a political issue, it is a manifestation of our collective trauma. And if we can understand injustice as a manifestation of trauma, then maybe we can understand that we can't build movements that tries to shut down injustice. A lot of activist movements where we move with this energy over here to shut things down, but we can't shut down injustice any more than we can shut down trauma. What we need to do with trauma is open things up. And so, how do we utilize nonviolent civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action, where we may be using our bodies to actually shut down a highway, to shut down a government meeting, to shut down a corporate production plan, or whatever it might be, while moving with the spirit of we're actually here to open things up? How do we design our actions, our movements in a way that makes people introspective, that makes people question what they're doing, their role in systemic injustice, as opposed to moving with this energy of we are here to shut you down because you're wrong, which makes people defensive, right? And doesn't allow for that introspection to happen.
Yeah, that's really, really important, I think. You noted that we live in a society that paints in black and white. We've talked about this a lot in some of our praxis programs, that kind of with us or against us that you're just talking about there. That as a society, we've lost the spectrum of color. We have the black and the white. You're with us, you're with against us, and there's spectrum that's in between, which is the history and the context, all the richness that one can bring to a problem or a demonstration, a protest, an issue, or injustice. I want to just, before I ask you the question with that, I wanted to bring out one thing you mentioned in there because, people who've been on these calls before will have heard me say this before, is differentiating between chaos, disorder, and order. Disorder and order are kind of the black and white, but chaos is something else. And from the original Greek definition of that word, it means boundless open space. Does not mean disorder. It's boundless open space that's kind of pregnant with possibility. So I see chaos as something really good. It's up to us what we do with it. It could end up in disorder or order, and that's kind of on us. So I wanted to kind of put that in there. You can comment on that if you want or not. But what I want to ask you about is what tools you use to help people get past this kind of polarized thinking, whether it's a war, they're on one side and against the other side, and they've blocked out the ability to see the issues on the other side. Do you have any tools that you use to help open people up to see more than they're seeing?
Sure. I mean, first on the point of chaos, there's a cosmologist named Brian Swimme who gave a lecture years ago, and he was talking about how the entire structure of the universe has emerged through chaos,
Mm.
right? The Big Bang that sent like particle gases all throughout the universe, and out of that chaos, planets emerged and stars emerged and life emerged, and that life is a result of chaos. So I really love you kind of discerning, helping us discern that. Um, so the black white binary us versus them worldview, in some ways, it's understandable because we live in times of such heightened crises, so much chaos, destruction, violence, injustice, climate catastrophes, immigration, like people getting locked up and deported, all of these things, that it's very easy for our brains to get into that state of panic, and we lose access to the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance. And so everything becomes black and white. You're either with us or you're against us. And I'm it's very concerning because I really do believe that that black white paradigm is at the heart of what is destroying our planet, right? When once you start thinking about there's us over here and them over there, we are living in a worldview of individualism and separation. And I think one of the fundamental truths of nonviolence is this unwavering belief that we live in an interdependent world. And once we see ourselves as somehow separate from those people, we no longer live in the worldview of interdependence, which I think is one of the most dangerous delusions that we can live with. And so you talked about, strategies to help us get out of that. I think it is so important in this like fast-paced, urgent like moment that we live in to find moments to breathe. I talk about at the end of my book finding that like hanging my clothes out to dry in the sun instead of using my dryer has become this important spiritual practice that helps me to slow down and to remember how human I am. There's something about doing practices that my ancestors have been doing for so much longer than dryers have been around that kind of reminds me of what it means to be human. And so whether it's hanging your clothes out to dry and feeling the weight of those wet clothes in your hand and feeling the sun behind your back, or taking moments throughout the day to just take a deep breath, these opportunities to slow us down and connects us to the higher, more evolved part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance is so important. One of my favorite quotes these days is from Bayo Akomolafe, who says, "Times are urgent, we must slow down." And so I think anything that helps us slow down helps us to connect with the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance.
Right. So these include like meditation. For me, it's very often playing the piano, just doing
Yeah.
music and getting in a completely different mind space. You have a quote from your book from Michael Nagler, who I also interviewed a while back, which I really liked. And it's quote, "In a world of falsehoods, truth is inherently confrontational." So I think that is really interesting. And that sits right in front of the chapter called A Crack in the Matrix, which I want you to talk about because I thought this was a really interesting story that you used that film basically about the Matrix. So I'd like you to maybe elaborate on a few lines that you wrote in that chapter, that nothing that the people in the Matrix did could get them closer to true liberation. Even their rebellion was part of the delusion and part of a plot line created by a computer. So first, for those who don't know and don't remember the Matrix, would you briefly explain that plot line? And next, how that metaphor can help us step out of the delusion that has captured us and see reality with clear eyes.
Yeah, so The Matrix was this, powerful film about like a, far distant in the future where robots have imprisoned humankind, and we now serve as just batteries that power and operate this artificial intelligence world, and they keep our minds like enslaved in this like delusional world where we live at the height of modernity in the late 1990s or early 2000s or whatever it is. And I imagine in the world of the Matrix, in this delusional world, there were groups of activists running around trying to fight the man, right? But even that effort to fight the man within the world of the Matrix would do nothing to actually free people from the Matrix because they were fighting these like these delusions within a made up world. And I find that a lot of our social change movements today, while the intention is so pure, are fighting within the world of the Matrix and they don't even realize it. Like a lot of the work that we were just talking about before we started, a lot of the work that happens in nonprofit organizations are more than we are like are courageous enough to admit, are completely consumed by this dominant system where we are spending so much time raising millions and millions of dollars to fund these large nonprofit organizations that do incredible work to support maybe small groups of 20, 30 people at a time in doing these programs. But when you take a step back, is doing nothing to challenge the broader systems that are causing so much harm. So I think part of the work of fierce vulnerability is being able to take a step back and look at the work that we're all doing and asking ourselves in the context of this particular moment in human history, where a lot of the climate science tells us that we have less than a generation to try to really shift things in a fundamental way, or we are going to face catastrophes that we just cannot foresee the scale of. In this moment where it feels like all of these systems, economic systems, political systems are on the verge of collapse. Like, what's the work that we're really doing? What does it mean to be doing social change work in this moment? Is it worth raising millions of dollars and spending years fighting for one piece of legislation? Or is there something bigger that we need to be looking at?
That is a critical question, I think, Kazu. I mean, that's something that whenever we get all these emails, we're bombarded with emails asking for money from all kinds of different Democrats and Democratic Party organizations. And you think, okay, where's it all going? What's it really doing? Is it really changing the system or is it just keeping it going? So these are the questions I've certainly had recently as I get bombarded with all this. And I think probably everyone hearing this is bombarded as well. And I'll go back to that quote that you used, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think that's an important thing to always have in mind when we're looking at, okay, what is really going to deal with the system, the problems of the system, and the need for systemic change. I want to go to a couple more things I want to do because I think we can get to them all. You noted in your book that the U.S. was founded on violence, slavery, and the destruction of the native people's land and their lives. And in some ways, our country has had this deep denial about the legacy. There are pockets of people who get it and understand it, but mainly our country as a whole has never accepted responsibility for this or been or held accountable for it. And I appreciated that you wrote, as I mentioned earlier, that accountability is not the same as punishment. How would you see accountability for this kind of past that would get us through the trauma of what we have done as a people?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to acknowledge that for me, true accountability is an act of love, right? If I commit harm, me going through a genuine process of holding myself to account for having committed that harm is part of my healing journey, right? And so when we talk about holding people accountable, we oftentimes see it as like a form of punishment, like we need to hold you accountable. We are going to shove accountability down your throat. But I oftentimes talk about how when we talk about holding people accountable, the key word there actually shouldn't be accountable, it should be holding. Like, what does it mean to hold space for people so that they can go through their own journey of accountability so that they can heal from the reality that they caused harm, right? So, in the context of the United States of America and racial justice, like, I really do believe that reparations has to be part of the process of healing. But it's important for like white identified folks to remember that reparations isn't a form of punishment. It is an invitation to repair. It is an invitation to heal in relationship. It is something that will help them move forward and for white folks to be able to heal from the collective trauma that they hold from the incredible levels of violence that their ancestors committed. And I really do believe that when violence on that significant of a scale happens, that collective trauma sticks in our bodies and it doesn't just go away because like time has passed, right? Um, so one more short story is that I talk about in the book. Like I used to think that my childhood traumas, I grew up in a really violent home. I used to think that it was this thing that like it happened 20, 30 years ago. I'm over it. I'm glad that I moved on. But then I realized how delusional I was when I first started exploring these childhood traumas, realizing how much it still impacts me. And the same thing happens in the United States where we tend to think, oh, slavery was hundreds of years ago. We've moved on. That's not how trauma and healing works, right? So again, like the fractals, it works the same way as it works in my body as it does in our collective bodies.
Yeah, very good points. And you also talked about the ability to hold paradox, and sometimes this is hard to do. Where you can see. I often use the Russia-Ukraine war as an example of this, where you have to see both sides, the issues on both sides, to really understand the complexity, rather than to dig in on pro-Ukraine, which often means more people killed in Ukraine instead of really pro-Ukraine. So being able to look at the larger, more complex situation is really hard in our society. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. And maybe I also want to put in something, I think it's related. Um, the ability to be comfortable in not knowing, which you also talk about. There are times when we can't know. And instead of jumping in with an answer and like we take a side right away, how do we get comfortable with not knowing for a period of time and say, I have to study this. I don't know enough yet. Um, how do you lead people in that area?
Yeah, so again, we live in times of such urgency and such panic. And when our bodies are in states of panic, we lose our ability to be in the mystery of paradox, right? And it's such an important thing to be in that paradox, to be in that place of I don't know, because you talked about like the big visions. For me, when you take an issue like Israel-Palestine too, to me, like people think about Israel Palestine and what could be potential solutions as like, oh, one state solution, two-state solution. And for me, I was talking to my friend Sujatha years ago, and she was talking about how she believes that the idea of a nation state is in itself a form of violence because it perpetuates the delusion of separation. And so, as someone who believes that the concept of a nation state is violent, then it doesn't matter one state solution, two-state solution, 10-state solution. Those are all state solutions that still rely on a worldview of violence that says, if I can draw a boundary around myself and build a big enough wall, then I will be safe. Right. And so, for me, like the big picture vision that we need to be talking about is how do we get beyond this idea that nation states and borders and walls will keep anybody safe long term? And when I start asking about like visions and questions that big, I don't know how to get there. And I think it's important because none of us as a species have ever been there to not. I think it's one of the problems in our world today is we live in this world where we think if we think long and hard enough about something, we'll be able to figure it out. And there's an arrogance to that worldview, and there's a humility and an importance in being able to say the changes that we need to experience as a species right now are so big, so transformative. We've actually never been through a change this big, so there's no way for us to know. But part of the fierceness and fierce vulnerability is to accept that we don't know all of the steps that we need to go through in this moment. But it's not going to stop us from trying to get to this world where we can live without borders and nation states either.
Well put. Saying the nation state is a form of violence, I interviewed another man, Andy Kimbrell, who's on our YouTube channel. And I should mention to everyone who's here that we do have a lot of programs on our YouTube channel, Praxis Peace Institute. And Andrew Campbell basically says the same thing, that the problems of war always go back to nation state and religion. So that's a whole other topic that we got into. And I think you're right on that. And we don't know. We are at a place in our evolution that we don't really know where we're going to end up, but we've got the intention to end up in the right place. And I think that's really important too. And the last question I'm going to ask before I open up to the people on the call is you write about the pillars of support that keep the status quo in place. And how, if we can knock down one or two of these pillars, the entire structure might start crumbling. And there's an opportunity to come in with a different, excuse me, a different plan, a different reality. Where do you think the weakest pillars are that are holding up the status quo right now? And how might we midwife the process into a transition there?
Yeah, well, I just want to name to begin by saying that like the pillars of support I named as the pillars of support is like a really common strategy in organizing spaces and movement spaces where like if we're trying to knock down the person in power, then that person in power is held up by all of these pillars, these institutions, and rather than trying to get to the dictator, which is usually impossible, if we can knock down like the institution of police or the military or business can create cracks in there, then the whole system will come crumbling down. And the reason I talk about that is because like there's a famous image of the pillars of support where this person is knocking down these pillars and this roof is going to come crumbling down. and to acknowledge that like we still live underneath these pillars. Communities, people live underneath these pillars. So if we continue to move with this, we are here to shut things down, we're here to break things down, we're here to tear down these institutions. The roof of these institutions are going to come caving and crashing down onto us. And so, yes, these institutions need to change, they need to transform, but is there a different spirit with which we can be doing this transformative work? And so rather than tearing something down, can we help at hospice, right? These institutions, these systems are crumbling anyways. And what does it look like for us as activist movements to see part of our role as we are like hospice care workers and death doulas to these dying systems, as opposed to coming in here with this attitude of we are here to tear these systems down? I think a lot of the what we do with our bodies has to look the same. We do need radical forms of nonviolent action, I believe, to respond to these times. But the spirit and the intention with which we do that work has to be radically different. And in terms of the question that you asked, Georgia, about what pillars might presenting us with the biggest opportunities, I think every pillar has opportunities. I've recently had so many amazing like restorative circles and trauma healing circles with police officers and prison guards. And when you can slow down enough to actually talk to them, they are so well aware that the institution of policing is violent even towards them, right? That the institution of police does not work for them either, and is not healthy for their souls either. They just don't realize that there are other ways to deal with the violence in our societies. And so I think with any institution, if we can go down and slow down enough to really talk to people, there's always opportunities for radical transformation in any institution.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up about the prison guards because uh, actually our governor Newsom took several, I don't know how many prison guards to Norway to learn about their system of policing and their guards for their prisons, which is completely different. Their prisons are pretty open. People aren't in cages. They live in like little apartments. It's a totally different system because they are focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. Very different focus. And I think we can learn a lot from that model. So there, I always believe if you look hard enough, you'll find models for all the things you've been talking about somewhere in the world. And
Definitely.
we can learn from these models. So I'm going to open it up now if people have questions. I feel like, Katie, go ahead. You want to unmute, Katie?
Thank you so much. I um I'm so excited. This was really, really interesting. Just a little context. So I'm a psychotherapist for 45 years. I just wrote a book about conflict, and so I'm very passionate about what you're talking about. I might send you an email, but the question I have is, can you say a little bit more about fractals and physics and how you see the parallel there? Because I spent 2 years trying to understand the physics of this, and I don't know if there's a book on physics made simple for psychotherapists, but any explanation you can give me or reference would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about fractals, one of the main examples that I use is if you're ever driving down, particularly like a dry climate on the side of a highway, you'll see when hot air mixes with cold air, it creates these little things called dust devils.
Yeah.
And if you take the science of what creates dust devils and just move up a level in the fractal, tornadoes create the same exact shape, but just at a much larger scale.
Hmm.
If you zoom out even more, if you look at a hurricane, it actually creates the same shape, right?
Yeah.
And then, the science is a little bit different, but if you continue to expand outwards, if you look at the way star planets rotate around its sun,
Hmm.
it creates the
Hmm.
same pattern. And then
Wow.
if you look at the way a galaxy rotates around the center of its axis, it continues to create the same pattern. It looks the same. And so, because I believe that the universe is built on a law of fractals, no matter how small or how large the scale, the same pattern repeats itself, right? And so that's one example. And I'm, in my book, I'm
I see.
theorizing here that trauma our relationship to harm, trauma, healing, violence, all of these things are also built on a fractal. So the same way that violence impacts me and the experience of violence gets frozen into my body as trauma, and then if I'm not able to release and integrate that trauma, I lash out and hurt somebody else. That is the dynamic of violence. It also happens at scale to families and cultures and races and nation states as well. And so a lot of fierce vulnerability is about, and as a psychotherapist, like at this point in our society, there's so much understanding about what it takes to heal trauma at the personal level and trying to take those lessons and extrapolate them and trying to figure out how to do it at scale for social wounds as well.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. That's a beginning for me.
Great. Do we have some other questions? I'm looking. I know they will come eventually, but they're slow. So I'm going to mention something you brought up in your book that I thought was really interesting too. You mentioned beauty as a disruptor. And, I've always been moved by the musicians on the Titanic, which you brought up in your book, how they played till they sunk, basically, knowing it was the end, and yet they didn't stop playing. It's an incredible lesson to us, I think, of focus, of accepting reality in a way that there was no other choice at that point. I mean, they could have done other things, but it would have been very selfish, I guess one could say. But I'd like you to maybe say something about beauty as a disruptor to the status quo.
Yeah, and I saw another hand too that we can go to after this. So for those that don't know the story, this is a real story of when the Titanic was sinking. The band that was on the Titanic understood that the ship was sinking and that they realized that there was no way for them most likely to survive. So what they did is they started playing their music and they kept playing until the ship sank. And survivors of the Titanic have shared the story. And I think it's such a beautiful, like, we live in such a death phobic culture. I was learning from one of my teachers, Jean Denny, who is a hospice care worker and started this thing called the School of Unusual Life Learning, or SOUL. And she taught me that death is not in opposition to life, it is a part of life. And only when we accept death as a part of the cycle of life can we really honor the fullness of life. And so, these band members were able to accept that death was approaching. And even in the face of death, they knew that creating beauty still meant something, right? It helped potentially calm the nervous system of even one more person on that ship so that they can accept where they are and to respond more skillfully in that moment. And so a lot of what I talk about in the book is, these systems all around us, ecosystems, political systems, economic systems, are dying. And in this moment of death, can we still create beauty? Like I used to dream about like being part of these like worldwide revolutions where we like save the world and stop climate change. And maybe that's not going to be possible. Maybe the best we can do is to create beauty, to affirm life, to create these small pockets of sanity. And maybe by doing these small acts of beauty, these small acts of community building, it will have ripple effects that are like unimaginable.
Another
And
fractal.
another fractal, right? Like creating small moments of beauty might expand into creating some large scale transformation that we can't even imagine.
Right. Now, Enid, did you have a question?
Yes, first I'd like to say hello and greetings to you. It's good to see you. I'm very interested in the interdependence concept because I think that is the fundamental key. If we can, I guess you can say, start with that mindset, the other types of pollution type thoughts of division and separation and all the isms will be erased. And we can see how the interdependence is going to see our relationship, our intimate relationship that we have with each other on all the different systems, not just on the human level, but with nature and everything else. So I think it was very key that you said that. And you also made me think of, lastly, of Adrienne Maree Brown's book, which is emergent strategies, pleasure activism, radical imagination, transformative justice, where she also looks at fractals and murmurations in the sky of bird formations. And so we have all of the answers around us visually in nature. We haven't been trained to see them or recognize them or appreciate them or analyze the relationship we have with them. So thank you, Kazu.
Yeah,
Thank you, and it's good
very
to see
well put.
you. I've been thinking about you a lot as your book came out and your play is doing big things. So really good to see you. Couple of things. One, the one kind of reframe that I would offer in what you said is you said we haven't been trained to like receive the lessons from the murmurations and things like that. I think what's actually happened is we've been trained out of noticing these things, right? Like as human beings, we all used to know that we are a part of nature. And all of the answers that we need, like you said, is all around us. I think so much of the work that we need to do as a species right now is to remember that we are a part of nature. And if we can take all of our lessons from everything that is around us, I feel like we would be doing a whole lot better. And then the piece on interdependence, I find it really interesting that as I talk to people and as I'm in a lot of healing spaces and trauma healing spaces, the fear that I don't belong, right? I think is one of the most common fears. I feel like every single person has experienced a thing and oftentimes holds a lot of trauma from this idea that I don't belong, that I am alone, that I'm by myself. And even though that is such a shared fear, it is also the biggest delusion, right? Because I really do believe fundamentally that we live in an interdependent universe, that this idea of interdependence is a universal law of nature, much like gravity is a universal law of nature. There are people on this earth that don't believe that gravity is real, but it doesn't matter that they don't believe it because it is a universal truth and they're still governed by its laws. And so there are moments where all of us, myself included, have this fear that I don't belong or I am alone. But it doesn't matter if that is the delusion that we're living in that moment, because in an interdependent world, there's nothing outside of belonging, right? And so I think the more we can do to remember that there's nothing outside of belonging to each other, the more we can build powerful movements that help expand that understanding and that help continue to broaden the circle of beloved community.
Great. Enid, could you put the name of your book in the chat box?
Yeah. And the name of your play too.
Yes, put it all in the chat box. I just put yours in the chat box, Kazu.
Thank you.
Definitely want people to be able to get that. Do we
I
have any
think
other
Katie
questions?
was also asking the book, Adrienne Marie Brown's book.
Oh,
That's
yes. Okay, we want that one too.
Books.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, yeah. Okay, Ben, go ahead.
Okay, unmuted. I really liked what you were saying at the beginning about how so much of people's behavior is being, conditioned by unconscious trauma. And I think I've read people who have tried to expand that theory beyond the individual to like the society itself. And it's pretty obvious to me that there's at least two major hinge points where the United States could have evolved into a more humane society, a less warlike society, but we missed the opportunity. And the two main ones that come to my mind is the failure to prosecute Reconstruction after the Civil War. And that is a case where the contingency of one man dying, Lincoln, put in place a guy who was sympathetic to the Southern cause, simply didn't like the idea of breaking up the Union. So he just let all those guys go. And so they just basically turned slaves into sharecroppers. Was never the kind of deep generational long coming to terms with what this practice was and what they had done. None of them paid an actual price other than the lower class people who had to fight in the armies. They got chewed up. But the people who funded it, who conceived of it, who ran it, they've got statues for these people all over the country. So we did not learn that lesson. And then the second one, which to me is like what we're living through now, is the failure to metabolize the trauma of 9/11. In fact, a trauma that was exacerbated and multiplied to some exponential degree by mass media, to the point where now people are willing to accept fascist government as a price for peace. And just my last comment is, I thought it was also astute how you recognize that when I'm around really hardcore lefty activists, they just want to tear the system down, tear the pillars down. And it's like, why isn't everybody jumping on our bandwagon here? Because people live under the roofs of those pillars. They're not really, if you're trying to knock the house down over their head, why are they interested in you? We need to offer people another vision of the future instead of we're just going to tear it down. And I just think that's an immaturity on the part of the left that we should address.
Yeah.
So that's it for now.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you pointing out those two particular moments in American history. What I was thinking was when you were talking about the Reconstruction era and the the abolition of slavery, and my one of my friends and dearest teachers, Bilji, who's an incarcerated nonviolence trainer, is serving a life sentence in Soledad State Prison right now. He once taught me that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And so often in our society, we only think so far as to how to fix the issue. So, like, what is the law that needs to change? What is the president that we want to elect? What is the CEO that we need to kick out of office? And those are in the realm of fixing issues, but we never think about how to repair the relationships that have been harmed throughout the conflict, right? So, like, after the abolition of slavery, the end of the Civil War, like, yeah, there were like there's like issues that could be resolved. Here's the new law that says we're a union, whatever, but nothing was done, like you said, to repair the relationships. And without that work, it's only a matter of time before the conflict bubbles up again, right? So, really appreciate you naming that.
Do we have other questions? Well, let's go back to mine if we don't. I'm looking. Okay. Oh, Katie, you want to ask something else?
Oh, thank you. I have to jump off for a client, but I just want to thank you so much. I'm very thrilled. I guess my only other thing I want to say is the thing I notice working with clients is absolutely, you're right that when I use a certain method of slowing down the dialogue, that's when you witness the repair happening. And so I have obsessed about how to create that in a political format. I know Peter Coleman has some interesting work in his book, A Way Out, about political groups, people working within large corporations and political groups. But I wonder about how to create those dialogues within a political debate for the President of the United States, for instance.
Absolutely. It's reminding me of this moment. I know you have to get going a little bit, but so feel free to go when you need to. Years ago, a family member was having a really difficult court hearing. And I remember them calling me after the court hearing where they received some bad news, and they were just like talking 100 miles a minute. And I asked them, I was like, hey, can you just take a deep breath with me? And as soon as she exhaled, she just started bawling.
Right.
And all of that emotional release that was made available because she slowed down, it didn't change the conditions of the court hearing,
Right.
but it did change how she was able to orient to it. And she was able to slow down enough to begin to think a little bit more clearly about what her next steps are. And so in political spaces, I oftentimes think about, like, what if our movements, even in small pockets, like I work with a small group of the Fierce Vulnerability Network in the Bay Area, what if we practiced breathing slowly, even in the midst of major demonstrations where there's tear gas and people screaming and yelling? If there's 30, 40, 50 of us that is trying to breathe slowly and move slowly through that space, can that have a ripple effect and change the dynamics of a really intense political demonstration?
Mm.
So yeah, this is one of the experiments that we're running.
You know, that's all happened in one place, and I don't know if anyone here on this call has seen it, and I'll look for the link. But on YouTube,
I
there
do
is
know what it was. If
the Oslo demonstration where women were, well, it wasn't just women, it was primarily women, but men were in it too, were walking parallel, like maybe four single lines walking parallel. No chanting, no sound, no music, nothing. They were holding dolls that were supposed to be dead babies. They were wearing the Palestinian scarves. I don't remember the name of them. Some of them had what, blood on their hands, and they were walking like this. And it was a completely silent demonstration. And it looked like hundreds of people who did this. The impact of it, I will never forget looking at the film, let alone what it would be for people who were there. So I think that's the kind of demonstration that might be breaking through what you're talking about. While Ben asks his question, I'm going to look for the link for that and put it in the chat box.
And just real quickly, Carol put in the chat box the Jewish Voices for Peace sit-in at the Capitol. And I think Jewish Voice for Peace is one of those groups that have been doing these powerful actions that have the fierceness to like shut down the Capitol, to shut down government buildings, but doing it through song and doing it through ritual, right? And that's
right.
something different than just yelling and chanting and screaming.
And the other thing that they actually did in that one sit-in that's on the video of it is that when the police were
Did you
arresting
know
and
Six
carrying
Flags
people
Budapest
off,
in Hungary?
Sorry. I guess I can't just get it without.
I guess you're not hearing me.
No, we
Yeah,
can hear you.
yeah, we hear you now. Sorry about that disruption.
Um, when the police were arresting people and they were in a circle, obviously in the rotunda of the Capitol, and they told each other, I don't know if one person was responsible for that, but someone said, let's breathe. We're
Yeah,
breathing in, we're breathing out. You know, it was a guided breath work
that's beautiful.
in the midst of it.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Ben, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, in terms of like paradigmatic frames which maintain this dominator worldview, uh, I just did a good part of my weekly radio show on KSVY talking about the death of Pope Francis and kind of looking at his environmental encyclical Laudato Si, and he outlines in that he said, you know, humanity is going through, there's three stages that we're having to go through in our evolution. The first stage, at least as exemplified in Christendom, was a dominator model where we're here to dominate, to conquer the land, to expel the non-persons who might be living there, and build our Christian civilization there. So the next step was a more liberal version, which was the steward, that nature is our servant, but it's our duty, like a farmer, to take care of their land, take care of things. But he said, I'm true to his namesake, Francis Assisi. He said, there's even a higher vision, which is the kinship vision, in which you recognize this world wasn't meant for just human convenience. We are one creature in this network of creatures. And so having that kind of sense of species humility almost, he said, is something that have a long ways to go to in this culture. The drive of our culture in toto is the dominator model on steroids. So we're, minor voices at the periphery of the empire saying, hey, there's another way out here, guys. But it's, we can't confuse ourselves that is the dominant mode, because it is not. So
One of our speakers said that we got all this originally from the book of Genesis in the Bible, that we are there to have dominion over nature, and that has been influencing all our thinking for millennia at this point.
And I also want to share too that I live in a community called Canticle Farms that is largely grounded in the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi. And so, to acknowledge that, yes, we live in this like dominator worldview that's coming from up high. But if you keep your ears close to the ground, there are so many communities springing up all over that have a vastly different worldview. And hopefully we'll see more and more of these springing up. And at some point, there will be more of that than the dominator worldview that is coming from up high too.
Would you put the name of your co-housing community in the chat box, Kazu? And then I think we have a question from Mike.
And I'll say I think calling it a co-housing community is a little limited because I think we do a lot more. There's a lot of programs that we run. Anyways, check it out, Canticle Farm in Oakland. Yeah,
Right.
Mike.
It's not really a question. Just first of all, thanks so much for this. It was really interesting. I'm not sure exactly. I'll follow up on it more about how evolutionary cosmology. I just want to throw in. You mentioned the beginning, and you mentioned Brian Swim, which is a name I'll never forget because we're the same age. And I had to look it up to see if it was the guy. I always remembered that name and the unusual spelling. And he played basketball at Santa Clara. I was there at the same time I was there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, some 15 years ago. So anyway, it was interesting. I'm not sure how the evolutionary cosmology, how you connected that with all this. So I'm going to have to either look it up more. I kind of missed some of that you were saying. I don't know if you can wrap that just a little bit, how that sort of tied into everything you were talking about today. Because once you said his name, I got my ADHD and I went off and looked him up. Anyway, it was great. Everything you said was fabulous today. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One of my great influences in the world are the teachings of Taoism. And one of the central teachings of Taoism is there's this thing called the Tao, which is this energy that moves through all of us, that if we can tap into it, it kind of aligns us with the flow of the universe. And one of the things that Brian Swim said in this lecture that he gave years ago is since the moment of the Big Bang, there's been this constant one singular source of energy that has moved throughout the universe. And it's out of that singular source of energy that life has been created. And when he talks about things like that, it reminds me of the Tao. Like I love things like cosmology because it is so close to a lot of spiritual traditions. And so Brian Swim to me is one of those people that really lives at the intersection of these like ancient wisdom traditions and spiritual teachings with science and understanding through scientific lens how the universe was created and what it means to align with the universe and the energy and the flow of the universe. So yeah, and the Tao of Pooh, Georgia said, is one of my favorite books. I actually have a tattoo of Winnie the Pooh because that book is,
The Tao of Pooh, I think, is just a great book, and The Day of Piglet.
yeah.
And I just put Michio Kaku's name in the chat box because he is an astrophysicist and does wonderful little YouTube selections that I look at all the time. And I've read a few of his books. He is a wonderful communicator on complicated science. And he's got a great sense of humor. He's lovely to listen to. So I would recommend him for some science too, that's understandable to lay people. He makes it understandable. Very interesting guy and very open-minded. I mean, really, in terms of what could be possible. Interesting to listen to.
He's also a long-term host and speaker on KPFA.
Yes, he is. Is
Yeah.
it still on Tuesday?
I'm not sure.
Okay, it used to be Tuesday at 2. I haven't had time to listen lately. I read and I watch YouTube. But if there isn't any more questions,
It looks like Enid had something, and then I
Oh,
had
Enid, do
a
you-
real brief thing.
You mentioned about how we can be calm in certain areas of chaos. And I think that's a very radical way of looking at how we deal with sound and how we don't always understand the power of silence. The book that I've just finished reading is Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hershey. And she looks at the fundamental concepts of how we can close our eyes just for a few minutes and stop and be calm. And I remember as a child, my grandparents and the elders in my family would always say, I'm not asleep, I'm just resting my eyes. And it's a form of meditation, it's a form of prayer, it's a form of just holding space for that silence. And that is something that she's developed this incredible book that I'll put into the chat because she's also saying, I'm resting for my ancestors for those who didn't have time to rest. I'm resting for all those who are in a position where they can't rest. And it's those that are living today and those who have moved on. So it has informed my recovery and healing. And I would strongly recommend it to all of us that we just take multiple moments during the day, just for a few seconds, or if it can develop into a few minutes. It makes a tremendous, significant difference in how conscious and present you are in order to have more of a radical transformation of your consciousness. So thank you, Kazu. Thank you. I also have to leave, and I just want to say thank you, everyone, for everything. This was.
Thank you for being with us. Be sure to put that
I'll do it before I leave.
yes, great, in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I do that every day. I realize I'm usually embarrassed to admit that no, I'm not busy all day and all night. I take time out every single day. But if I tell people that, they think I'm being lazy. So there's this point where you have to do that for your own well-being. And I think bringing that up, really is important for people to know. Every day we need rest where we're not asleep. Yeah. So Kazu, do you have anything final you want to say to our group?
Well, I don't know how I'm gonna tie this up, but I do want to comment on Ben said, watch out for that tattoo in China, because as many people may know, people used to make fun of Xi Jinping because he apparently looks like Winnie the Pooh, so they banned Winnie the Pooh throughout China. And I also have a tattoo of the Boston Celtics, my favorite team. And a couple of years ago, there was a player on the Boston Celtics who was advocating for freedom of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. And so they banned the Boston Celtics in China. So like I have two tattoos that are banned in China, and there is something about that reminds me of that quote from Michael Nagler, Georgia, that you were talking about um, in a world of falsehoods, the truth is inherently confrontational. And I think there's so much power. You don't have to get a tattoo of it, but just knowing what your deepest truths are, knowing what your values are, and speaking it into the world, and that alone can have so much transformative power.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much, Kazu. This has been one of the richest programs I think we've had, and we've all learned something from it. In fact, I'm going to send it to everybody because who's on this call and who signed up, and it's not here on person, an article that I wrote about Mondragon, because this is a model of how we could be living on the planet. It's actually happening somewhere, and I'll send it to all of you. It's like 13 pages. You may not want to read it all, but you might.
Oh, and one more quick thing.
Yeah.
Rachel Gladys, who you said is going to be on this program next week, is a close
Yes.
friend that I was just hanging out with in Boston. So definitely a big plug for that show next week.
Great. Thank you for that shout out, Kazu. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us. You'll get the link tonight to the recording of this, and you can share it with your friends and make sure people see it. This is really good information. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. And go
Thank you,
Celtics.
Kazu. Great to be
I
here
grew
with
up with
you
them.
all.
Go Celtics, man.
Go
They started
Celtics.
out bad in this series. Very bad. They're behind.
Everybody's talking at once.
Oh,
All right,
sorry.
thank you.